more crazy and hectic because of the Harrison Bucker situation. So we had some stuff going there with all of that, which was really fun. Oh, there goes my time limit on Instagram for the day. And we're back. So this week's live stream is going to be all about the idea that holiness does not equal people pleasing. So those are two very different things. I am tweaking out on Instagram here. Let's try this again. Goodness. All right. Let's try this again. Freaking app messed it up. Life is hard. All right, let's try it again. Mm, 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 mm. All right, so holiness does not equal people pleasing. You know, I think there's a lot of Catholics out there that do believe this to an extent, right? They don't, tell you out the gate. They wouldn't say that people pleasing is more important than being pleasing to God. But there is a lot of people who act that way, who live that way, right? People who live with this mindset that as long as other people aren't mad at me, as long as we kind of go along to get along, right? I think, and again, this isn't going to be a total, this isn't another episode or another reflection or another live stream on the Harrison Butker situation, but this is more going to be some of the reflections that I have coming out of a week of dealing with that. So if you follow me on social media, if you follow me on Instagram specifically, you know that Ish was crazy last week, right? Like shit was going down, man. People were mad. People were big mad. And I understand. Like it was a sensitive topic for a lot of people. And so I don't want to totally like disregard people being upset by it. And I'm not going to really go into a lot of the comments and things. I think that's going to be a podcast episode eventually. If you listen to this week's podcast episode on should a Catholic attend a gay wedding, then you saw or you heard me go into some Instagram comments from recently, and that was really enjoyable segment for me. I hope if you guys had thoughts on that, let me know if you had any thoughts on me kind of reading some Instagram comments and some of the hate comments that I get. To me, a lot of it's entertaining. Sometimes it does kind of, get my gander going for sure. Can get me pretty worked up and pretty frustrated. But generally speaking, I think that I deal with the hatred that I see on social media a lot of times. Doesn't really bother me. It doesn't get to me, and definitely not to the rate that it gets to a lot of people. But I want to just talk about this concept of people pleasing. I think is really tied up in something that Harrison did say, which is that the Church of Nice is a losing proposition. That was something that's a direct quote from his speech. And Matt Walsh wrote a book called The Church of Cowards recently in the last few years. I think it came out in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And it had a very similar theme, right? That this idea that we as a church, when we make niceness our priority, especially over holiness, then we are not going to be good evangelists. We're not going to be good lights in the world. We're not going to be effective at spreading the news of the gospel, right? Jesus himself says that he came to not to unite people, but actually to divide, to put son against father and husband against wife, because he gave people a decision to make. He gave people the ability to say, okay, either you're going to choose this way, the truth and the life, or you're going to reject it. You're going to walk away from it. And a lot of times as a church, we don't like to give people those options. We don't like to allow people to have the opportunity to choose by telling them the truth, to say, hey, when it comes to the gospel, when it comes to repenting of your sin, to the lifestyle that you might be living, this isn't like a nice to have, and you can kind of live without it, be fine. You'll be okay either way. Like the gospel is a need to have for salvation, for eternal life. And it's tricky for a lot of people because we live in our daily lives, especially in the United States of America, especially because we're so well off as a nation. And I know that obviously times are tight, the economy's crazy, but generally speaking, for the niceties, the things that we have that we don't need, this is a pretty great time to be alive. And we have so many things, right, that we a lot of times don't. We're just not forced into remembering our need for God. We're not forced to remember that we truly do need Him. And when we forget that, then we can not just forget it for ourselves, but even us as people who are bought in, people who are living the faith, we don't evangelize with the same urgency because we don't believe that other people need God. We often think of God as a nice to have, and you can see that by the just our very soft efforts at evangelization. We don't want to disrupt anything. We don't want to make anybody mad. We don't want to piss anybody off. And we have to remember that first and foremost, like holiness is loving and serving God above all else. And God at times is going to call you to be bold. God's at times going to call you to do things that are uncomfortable, to maybe call somebody out, maybe have a difficult conversation. And I'm going to get into some of the distinctions that we need to make there as we navigate this and discern what it is God's calling us to and what he's not. But just kind of a last thought on the Harrison situation that I think really came up in my mind as I was talking to a friend of mine on Instagram, actually, who I greatly respect and really love. I think she does some amazing work on social media and in her personal life is an amazing woman. But we were having this conversation and she was telling me about how, um, and I think this is there's these extremes, right, that we can tend to live in. And I think that a lot of times us Catholics today, you have people that live in the extreme, typically people that attend Novus Ordo, very liberal parishes, where they say we never need to evangelize, never need to share hard truths, we never need to preach or have homilies on abortion or same-sex marriage or any of the tough topics because it just ostracizes people and it just causes more pain and does more harm than good. Then you have, I feel like on the other side of that, the trads and sometimes the mostly the more radical traditionalists. Important to note that on both sides, you'll have people who might identify as more liberal. On their closer side to the middle, you're going to have some pretty good Catholics. On the most, radical trad side, on the closest side, or the traditional side, on the closest side to the middle, you're going to have some pretty great Catholics as well. But each side in their extremes, they go into these extremes when it comes to evangelization, where the most radical trads on the right will say, that's all we need to preach about. It's just fire and brimstone, just hell and fear of hell, and all of those things every single day and always. I've described sometimes the feeling that I've had at TLM parishes where it feels like you have Catholics that want Easter without Good Friday. And sometimes at some of the more TLM parishes, you can feel like it's Good Friday forever. Right. But we were basically having this debate on, is it useful to evangelize in the way that Harrison attempted to in his speech, where basically you're really, really calling things out. You're being very direct in what you're saying in your messaging. And, it can be like it can be a give and take, right? You don't know for sure what the appropriate response all the time is. But what I struggle with is I feel like we have this tendency, even a lot of Catholics in the middle, we have this tendency to believe that we never have to be strong in our approach to evangelization, right? We always have to be soft. We always have to be constantly gentle, and I think people are just generally tired of it, right? I kind of thought about this when I was sharing with her about the standing ovation that Harrison received at the end of the speech, because everybody in my Instagram post, you may have seen me comment on this, that I said a lot of people just don't know Benedictine's culture. When he said most of you are probably looking more forward to the family that you'll have than the career promotions you're going to receive. I use the example of my wife, Emily, who sat in those same seats 5 years ago, received an award for how accomplished she was at Benedictine College. And there's no doubt in her mind that on that day and every day before then and every day since then, she's looked forward more to what she's doing now as a stay-at-home wife and mother than she did anything in her career. And she went on to do awesome things in the church and in evangelization. She made amazing progress and did some great work, but none of that was more important to her than being a wife and a mother. And so that's an important caveat to make. And she said, oh, well, we talked to some people, this person I'm talking with on Instagram, she says, well, we talked to people who said that it was awkward there, that you could feel like the tension in the room and people didn't know how to respond. And I said, it's weird that people say that to me because I was in the room and I saw the standing ovation and I was genuinely shocked because of how strong the speech was. I was genuinely shocked at the end to see that people stood and applauded at the rate that they did because of the fact that there was so much in there, right? There was just so much meat that was packed into this speech. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking as he's getting to the end of it, I'm like, everybody here had to agree with part of that or disagree with part of it. I would say, right? Because a lot of people there were going to the Novus Ordo, which I feel like he really kind of poo-pooed on. Some people would get defensive about the priest and the bishop comment. Some people would get defensive about the NFP comment. Some people might get defensive about this or about that. Nobody, I don't think, in the room thought much of him talking about his wife's experience. That was kind of the internet and the secular media. But I think it's interesting to think that all of those people still stood and applauded. Why? Even though we didn't all agree with it. I didn't agree with everything that he said. Why did I still stand and applaud? Because we're just tired of cowards. We're just genuinely and generally tired of the church of nice. We're tired of people who just, we have these commencement speeches, we have these speakers, we have all these things, and people get up and they say nothing. And this is the thing that I think frustrates so many people, that when they see this, and there's a lot of women who get offended by this and get upset by this, and it's the same ones that don't recognize a lot of times. This is what I get to with like my hot takes on dating, my Catholic assessment of feminism, or my not my Catholic assessment of feminism, my assessment of Catholic feminism, if you can even say such a thing without making it somewhat of an oxymoron. I know some people do. Obviously, there's a lot of Catholic women out there who identify as feminists. But a lot of times what we miss, there's so many Catholic women in the church today who complain that we don't have good Catholic men. There's not enough good men out there. And to an extent, I agree with you. But it's things like this that push them away. So many Catholic women want the church to be so feminized. We have to be so feminized in everything that we do. Everything has to be gently packaged, and nothing can be strong, nothing can be bold, nothing can be courageous. Everything always has to be nice and kind and polished, and you can't say anything that would offend anybody, because we're not capable of being you know, anti-fragile, right? To actually hear something that we disagree with and wrestle with that disagreement. Instead, we have to be offended by everything. We have to talk about how rude he was and how judgmental and racist and transphobic and all the things, just like the world does. We can't just say, wow, I really appreciate his courage that it took to say that, because 99% of people online, 99% of, not 99%, 90% of Catholic influencers don't say anything about the terrible things that happen in the church or in the world. They're totally silent about it. But then whenever the world gets upset about something, then they'll find their Catholic reason why they're upset about it and say, oh, like, you're saying that we're not allowed to be upset about this because X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, I'm not saying that. But where were you when they were doing the trans chants in St. Patrick's Cathedral? Where were you when Father James Martin was blessing couples on the cover of New York Times? Silent, quiet, no problem there, right? When we had this confusing document come out of the Vatican about that literally said words that you can bless same-sex couples. Shout out to Pope Francis for clarifying that this past weekend on 60 Minutes. He was very bold there as well. I don't know if you guys saw some of the quotes from 60 Minutes, but Pope Francis did his damn thing on 60 Minutes. That is for sure. He was crushing it. But all these things, right? When you have these great offenses and these terrible things happening, even within the church or without the church, or from without, from externally, when we're getting assaulted and attacked and all these things, you don't hear anything from so many of these influencers. And that was something that a friend of mine on Instagram said that I thought was also really telling. And she said, you can tell a lot about people by what they get upset about and what they're silent about. And I was like, man, that is so powerful, because it just can drive me insane, especially the Catholic. And I don't want to make this all about Catholic women on Instagram, but a lot of it is, man, because this goes back to what I'm saying, that everything has to be nice and soft constantly. And then we have the same complaint in the same breath. People will complain that there's no Catholic men. There's no good men in our pews. Why is that? Because we're also effing tired of everything having to be so feminized, so effeminate constantly. This is why you have so many young men out there who are being drawn to, I hate to use them in the same sentence, but I think they have this in common. Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, the manosphere, right, that they rail against constantly. Do those people have their issues? Absolutely. I think that feminists and the manosphere have one thing in common, and that's both of them defend their gender at all costs and think that the feminists think women do no wrong and all mothers are great and all women are great. No matter what they do, they're amazing and all this stuff. And men on the manosphere, it's like everything is amazing and everything we do is perfect and there's no flaws here. We both be better to just actually turn inwards and let the men fix the men and the women fix the women. But then women, sometimes when you have a man that's on stage speaking in a bold and masculine way, we don't have to make him effeminate. We don't have to turn him and say, oh, no, actually, you need to be feminine like many of the other commencement speeches we heard this past weekend that nobody cared about, that nobody will remember, that had no actual message to them because they didn't want to offend anybody. And that's what we constantly are forcing upon everyone, because we believe that people pleasing equals holiness. We believe that if you're not making people upset, if you're not offending people, then you're being holier. And yeah, we're going to be offended and we're going to be upset. We're going to argue amongst each other and amongst Catholics, and we'll push back on the Catholics when they're being overly masculine and when they're being, misogynistic and all these things. But you never want to call out anybody who's on your side. Nobody, when they're doing things that are, overstepping ministry to the LGBT community, then you don't say anything. That's weird. It's weird to see when people kind of pick and choose when they're upset, when they're going to write their blogs and articles, and when they're not. You can really tell a lot about people. You can tell a lot about some of your favorite influencers by what they get upset about, what they get offended by, and what they don't. And I think so many of us, especially men, the reason why people stood and applauded at Benedictine College was we are tired of nice. We are just so sick and tired of people not having the courage to say the things that need to be said. And even when somebody gets up and they say things that we don't think necessarily need to be said, but they do say some things that we do think need to be said, we're going to applaud for that because there's so many soft, cowardly people that aren't willing to actually be bold and ever say something that's we know is true, the church has affirmed is true, that we can just put out there and be bold about. You see this all the time. I get so frustrated. I used to love Lecrae and Andy Minnie and all these Christian rappers, but they do this exact same thing that I'm accusing some of these Catholic feminists online of doing, is that they want to get all riled up for them. It's Black Lives Matter typically. They're all up in arms about Black Lives Matter, but you never hear them say almost anything on abortion. They never want to say anything about, same-sex marriage or the trans community going after kids. Like, then it's just total silence. But if anything BLM comes up, they're the first ones to speak out and say something. And that's the same thing that I think happens in the Catholic, not all, and this definitely is not all Catholic women online, but a lot of times it can be that whenever like women are thought to be slighted, and a lot of them interpreted the NFP comment, I don't understand why. I had somebody say to me, as a woman, I was really offended about the NFP comment because of women that practice NFP and all this stuff. And I'm like, I don't know. In my NFP classes, it was said that we were doing it together. But now that it's an offendable thing, it's only women's, NFP is women's thing. But then when it's supposed to be, we're brought in, I don't know, whenever you decide to bring us in, we'll just be at your beck and call, I guess, beck and call to just take responsibility for NFP when it's convenient. But somehow that was a slight against women and a misogynistic comment. But it's just so frustrating that is the time, right? Whenever it's the progressive moment to be offended, it seems like that is the time when a lot of these influencers, that's when they want to speak on a current event. That's when they want to speak on something that's happening. When you have other opportunities and other options, they don't say anything. And it's very similar to what the Christian rappers do with BLM. And it drives me insane to see that as well, because to say, if you think that when God's getting frustrated at our Sodom and Gomorrah, which is the United States of America, that he thinks that the things happening to Black people in the United States in 2024 are worse than the things happening to children, are worse than abortion, then I don't know what type of crack cocaine you must be smoking, but it's got to be powerful. It's got to be that strong-ish, man. You got to be on that strong stuff. But we're tired of the constant disclaimers. I can say this as a content creator myself. I made that post, that swipe post, the carousel, that literally was about correcting things that he said that people claim that he said that he didn't say, right? And going back through actual quotes from people and saying he didn't actually say that. This is what he actually said. And it's just amazing. Like, I don't understand it. And I posted about this on my story the other day. But a number of people from the LGBT community coming in there and talking about how homophobic it was because he said that Pride Month celebrates sin. And I'm like, what? Where is this even coming from? But it's amazing to me. And this kind of goes back. There's a really beautiful comment I felt like from one woman. You got to see two different people respond to the post. And one woman said and expressed her feelings about feeling less than because of her infertility. She was never able to have children. And she had this beautiful and I thought really humble and insightful comment that she said, I feel slighted by things like this sometimes, but I recognize that sometimes I feel that way. I feel offended by comments about motherhood or the importance of motherhood or stay-at-home moms and all that kind of stuff. She said, sometimes I feel offended by that because of my own pain and my own wounds and not because of what somebody else said. And I'm like, man, if only all of us could have that humility. If only all of us could have that humility to say, okay, not every single thing is calling me out. Not every single thing is calling me out directly. Sometimes somebody actually has a message from stage or in a podcast that is not directly about me. And it's unbelievable how many Catholics just believe that every single piece of content, every single thing that they see, if there's some slight connection between the piece of content, the words being spoken, the words that are written, and them, they want to make it about them. And I legitimately cannot understand that, but it drives me up a wall. I've had people say things like that to me where I remember Emily and Caroline Owens, once called Caroline Owens, now Caroline Zipperly. Shout out to you, Crow. Always Crow to me. We did this podcast where we did Q&A and somebody asked about IVF, in vitro fertilization. And we were talking about how the church has condemned it and said that it's an unnatural practice and that Catholics shouldn't do it. It's sinful. Somebody responds to me on Instagram and says, "You know what was really rude and hurtful in that podcast is you didn't say that kids born from IVF are still good and valuable and all these things, and I was conceived through IVF, and you didn't affirm that." And I'm like, okay, do do we have any common sense remaining amongst the crowd? Are there any people out there that still exist and live in the world that have common sense? I understand how things like that can be hurtful, but if you have the humility that this woman that I was just referring to that commented on my carousel, if you can just take a moment and say, "Wow, that was offensive." Was this person actually talking about me? Were they actually intentionally trying to make me feel bad? And if not, why do I feel bad? It's probably the devil. It's literally that simple, right? Like it's literally that simple to take a moment and just say, I always use the example with that comment to say, okay, I've been through many talks and many conferences and retreats where people would say, hey, fornication is a sin. I was conceived out of wedlock. I don't sit there as a person who's conceived out of wedlock and say, wow, they're saying that sex outside of marriage is a sin. My life must be meaningless. I must be worth nothing to the world because my parents conceived me when they weren't married. No, because you know why? Because I'm not smart. I'm not an intelligent man, but I'm not an idiot. And so I can sit there and say, okay, even though there might be that far-fetched connection that maybe the devil is trying to make in my mind, I can recognize this person actually is just condemning fornication. They're not saying that I have no worth or value as a human because I was conceived through fornication. That like the mental gymnastics you have to take to get there, just let go. Just let go. You're doing the flips and the swinging to get the mental gymnastics to get from point A to point B. Just stop somewhere along the route from point A to Crazy Town. Just get out of the car, man. Just let it go. Just drop. Just move. Just let it be. You don't have to be insane. We don't have to give constant disclaimers for every single thing that happens, for every single circumstance. And that's what you get with some of these things. And I get with some of those topics, it's tough. You can look and analyze the speech and say, okay, some of those not worth touching on because it just need to go a little bit deeper. They need more context. And that's some of the pastoral aspect, I think, that sometimes that trads can lack. And I think when you try to pack a lot into one short talk, it can be too much at times. And I don't disagree when people say that that's what happened. But I'm just saying here that I think the people stood and applauded because they were like, man, I'm just glad somebody finally said it. Somebody finally had the courage to say it. I've experienced that in my own life, my professional career, friendships online, where people are just like, thank you for finally saying that. Thank you for articulating this position. Thank you for not making me feel, or for helping me to not feel crazy about believing X, Y, or Z, or for standing against this or that. And we just need more of that. I think people are just tired of it. We want to see people actually be bold and live our faith. And we have to balance that aspect of like, we're called to be lights in the world, right? I love Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In a similar way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. And I love that. That's one of my favorite passages of scripture, hence why I've memorized it. But you also have in John chapter 1, right? The beginning of John, the final gospel that we used to read after Mass, every single Mass, right? And if you go to the TLM, you still hear it heard after every single Mass. And I wish that was a practice still, because I absolutely love it. But it says here, the light shines in darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. And it talks about how Jesus entered into the darkness and how he was rejected by the people, right? He was in the world and the world was made through him, yet the world knew him not. He came to his own home and his own people received him not. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And there's just that beautiful aspect that we are called to be lights in the world, but we're lights in darkness. And there are many spirits of darkness, there's many movements of darkness that hate the light. And so you're going to receive hate. You're going to receive pushback. You're going to receive negativity from people because you're striving to be the light in the darkness. And if you're never receiving any type of pushback, any type of criticism in living out your faith in today's super, super secular culture, in today's super anti-Catholic culture, then something is wrong. And it's not that all of us are called to make these huge waves and to be disruptive and confrontational, but you can't never experience. I truly believe there's not going to be a saint that gets to the end of their life in the 21st century that received no criticism or negative feedback throughout their time here on earth. Doesn't mean you can't go to heaven, but I think that it would be a bad sign for me if I was somebody's spiritual director and they were 80 years old and they were like, "How do you think I did?" And they were like, "I never made anybody upset. Do you think I'm going to heaven?" I'd be like, "I don't know, man. That seems like it's not a good sign." To be perfectly honest with you, in today's world, you probably should be pissing people off. What's important to note there, and this is something I've been praying about, and I've been spending time with my spiritual director, St. Francis de Sales, in Introduction to the Devout Life. And one thing he's talking about as we're getting to the third part here, and we're getting deeper into virtues, is he really emphasizes that we don't need to intentionally try to piss people off. That's where we also get off base, right? We have a lot of Catholics who do try to do that from time to time, that are just intentionally trying to anger people, intentionally trying to upset people. I can fall into that trap sometimes. Sometimes I post things, and especially in the comment section, I can get like this sometimes, where I'm not really trying to win people over. And I think we have to be understanding too that there's times to be direct and blunt and forthright with the truth, and there's times to be we want to mix, obviously, evangelization with gentleness, with virtues, right? But there is times that no matter how kindly you put the truth, people are going to be offended by it, or somebody's going to be upset by it, or somebody's going to get angry by it, and you might receive hate as a response to that. That's always going to be the case. It's always going to be a risk that you run. But I love this quote as he's talking about St. Francis de Sales is going through the different virtues that we need in life. And he had this quote that I just thought, I'm going to take it somewhat out of context, but I think really gives a good point here. It says that sugar is more agreeable than salt, but salt is in much more universal requisition, right? We use salt a lot more frequently, even though sugar is more agreeable, right? And so it doesn't mean that we need to be salty. That's not the context that he's thinking of, right? I don't think he used salty in the way that we think of saltiness, but just thinking about that sugar is more agreeable than salt, but salt is much more universally required. And he says how we want to have virtues that are more universally required rather than the ones that are just kind of used for specific moments. But he goes on to reflect that we all in different stations and vocations in life have different requirements and different virtues that are most needed for us, right? Most needed for our station, our vocation, our lane that we're in life. And we want to be thinking about that. And he says that we should go for the virtues that are most needed, not just the ones that are most attractive. And this can be a place too where I think you can call out the chat sometimes, is he says that some of the more superficial ones that can feel cooler or feel better is things like fasting and mortifications and things like that. He actually says that those are not superior to things like gentleness and cheerfulness. He actually says that those are more important than fasting and mortification. And so really interesting. There's a lot to get into there, and I'll have more comments and thoughts on that as I get deeper into St. Francis de Sales' reflections on virtues. But I just want to close this out with just this brief example that I love from King David. I've done some content on this in the past, but King David has this great example. I encourage you to go and read it in the second book of Samuel. This is in chapter 16. It starts at verse 5. And just to give some context here, this is what I think. And King David, for those who don't know, I'm kind of weird for this, but King David is actually my confirmation saint. Technically, you can pick an Old Testament character, especially one of the fathers of the faith, to be your confirmation saint, or at least I did. I don't know if you want to push back on that. You can tell me I'm a heretic or something, but I was only 13. So now you seem like a bully for making fun of me for having David. But King David gives this great example. I'm going to summarize a lot of it. He's going through a lot. His own son's trying to kill him. Things are really bad within his family. His son's threatening basically to take his kingly throne. And he's walking through this village or on his path from town to town, kind of escaping his son who's trying to kill him. And he has this guy who's an enemy of his, whose name is Shimei. And Shimei is basically throwing rocks at King David and cursing him. He's saying things like, be gone, you man of blood, you worthless fellow. The Lord has avenged upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your ruin is on you, for you are a man of blood. Now, what's most interesting about that, he makes these comments about Saul. And there's so much to take here from this, because he's making these comments about Saul as though David stole the throne from Saul when David actually had multiple opportunities to kill Saul and chose not to, right? David only tried that time and time again to do right by Saul. But David does know, and this is so real, man, because this is just literally my experience online the last week, is you get a lot of hate, you get a lot of negativity, and people make up lies about you. Bucker's going through the same experience where people are making up all these lies and negative things about you, but you can at the same time recognize your own sinfulness, recognize your own brokenness and your own need for repentance and obviously God's mercy. But David gives us this beautiful example where his one of his men says, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over there and take off his head. So he's got his homies, right? David's got some ride or dies that he's like, yo, let me just go kill this dude. Why are we even playing games with this guy? He's a scrub. Let's just kill him. And David has this great response. He says, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, curse David, who then shall say, why have you done this? And David said to all of his servants, behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more may this man? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look upon my affliction and that the Lord will repay me with good for this cursing of me today. And I love that quote, man. He literally says, you know what? He's like, I've got bigger things going on in my life, more important things to attend to. And it might be that God has told this man to curse me today. God may have prompted this to happen. Maybe he wants me to grow in virtue. Maybe he wants me to grow in mortification. I don't know. But he said, maybe this is God's will. And if it's not God's will, maybe God will look upon the suffering that I've gone through here today and reward me for it. But he says, let's just keep going. Let's stay focused on our task at hand. And that's what all of us need to do. When you're sticking true to the faith, when you're being bold, when you're sharing the good, the true, and the beautiful that God has placed on your heart and giving you this light to go out and share with the world, you're going to receive negativity. You're going to receive hatred. May we all have the courage and the steadfastness of David, who looked upon that hate and said, you know what? I got to keep moving. I got bigger fish to fry. I got a lot going on. And we need to just keep going. Maybe God has asked this man to do this to me. Maybe I'm receiving this negativity, this hatred for a reason. May God make good out of my suffering. And that's possible for all of us. And so that's my message for you today. Thanks for tuning in to this weekly live stream. If you want more content like this, you can join on Locals. Thank you to our local supporters. I just saw somebody made a support there on Locals while we were live here today. And so you can always join us at seekingexcellence.locals.com for more content like this. And of course, subscribe to the podcast where you can get the weekly podcast. All right. God bless you all. We'll see you next time.